Right now, I'm joined by Senate candidate J.D. Vance, a Republican running here in Ohio. We appreciate you stopping by.
Sure.
So you guys are in the final stretch of the campaign. You know, you're in Dayton today. You hosted a Chamber of Commerce event. You spoke at it. And, you know, coming up on Monday, President Trump is going to be here showing support in Vandalia. How important has Dayton been during this final stretch of the election season?
Yeah, it's very important. You know, I'm a Middletown guy, so to me, Dayton was sort of the big city growing up, and so I love this community, and I love what it represents, and I love, you know, the potential here. I think Dayton obviously had a rough patch, and it's starting to build itself out of it. And part of my job, I think, as a U.S. Senator, is to make it possible for Dayton to continue to build on what's great about this city and to continue to create a lot of prosperity here for the residents. So it's very important for us. I think just electorally, we expect to do very well in the Dayton area, not just the city, but of course the suburban areas around Dayton. And so it's great to be here and great to make a couple final stops before the campaign winds down.
You mentioned the rough stretch here for Dayton. In previous years, obviously, we saw General Motors up and leave.
Of course.
The community seemed to have rebounded since then, but right now, a lot of people are struggling financially due to inflation and the economy. You know, as a senator, what would you be able to do, propose to help ease some of that financial burden for voters?
Well, there are a couple of things that we have to do really right away. I mean, first, we have to stop borrowing money and spending it on things that we shouldn't be spending money on. That adds to the fuel of the fire of inflation. That makes it harder for people to afford gas, people to afford groceries. That's one of the reasons why interest rates are so high, which makes it impossible for a lot of people to afford homes. So we really need to get control of the spending in Washington that's driving some of the inflation. The other thing that we can do to provide immediate relief is to actually open up America's energy markets. One of the big drivers of inflation is that we're begging Saudi Arabia and Venezuela for oil and gas when we have plenty of that stuff here at home. And if you allow Ohio investors and Ohio workers to get this stuff out of the ground, it drives down energy prices, drives down food prices. It also provides a lot of good jobs for people all across the state of Ohio. And I think the energy policy is actually the biggest unforced error that's driving inflation, something I'd really like us to get better and something I'm going to work on in the United States Senate.
Do you think this is a quick fix, or do you think this is something that's going to take a while to, I guess, level back out?
Well, I think unfortunately, just because of the policies that we have right now in Washington, D.C., inflation is probably going to be a fixture of the next few months at least, and probably the next couple of years in our country. The question is, how much damage can we do? How much can we bring the inflation under control? And I think if we have better leadership, we can see some immediate relief, but it's going to take a little while to really bring this inflation problem under control.
You recently, during the primaries, you got President Donald Trump's endorsement, which helped put you over the edge and beat Josh Mandel. The president's coming back to stump for you coming up on Monday, the day before the election. How big of a deal was that for you to get the president out here and for him to be able to give you that final push over the finish line?
Well, the president is great, really, at turning out the vote, and that's the thing that we really need to happen. I feel very good about where we are, but that depends on people actually getting out there to vote. And I think the president will host a big rally at the Dayton airport. I think we'll have a lot of people there. It'll be a lot of fun. I hope the weather cooperates, but certainly it's going to be a critical part, I think, of getting people to the polls and making sure, I think we're ahead, but you got to make sure you actually get people to the polls so you win the race.
There have been some concerns from some Republicans that President Trump will drive more Democrats to the polls. Is that not a concern for you?
I think it's unlikely, and at the end of the day, I mean, I think the thing that I hope people remember is that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we had real prosperity in this country. We had wages rising, we had inflation under control, we had a lot of new jobs being created. I'd just like to get back to some of those common sense policies to deliver prosperity for Southwestern Ohio, but for the entire state of Ohio. So no, I think it's great to have the president here, and I think it'll certainly be helpful to us down the stretch.
Talking about the city of Dayton in general, typically this has been a Democrat city for many years. Last election it went to President Biden. Donald Trump was actually the first Republican to win since the 1980s when George H.W. Bush won. Do you think that he has a unique impact on Dayton, and do you think Dayton can go back to being red after being blue this last election?
I certainly hope and expect to keep the Dayton area red and to build on that during my time in the Senate. I think what was really different about Donald Trump is that he was one of the first major American political figures to call out some of the trade policies that meant that Dayton lost a lot of good jobs to Mexico, to China, and to other places. And I think that, we really, if we do not have our own manufacturing independence, if we continue to hemorrhage jobs to China, we're never going to be a prosperous country. I think people in Dayton, because they suffered so much from those bad trade policies, Dayton gets it more than most parts of our state, and consequently, I think they were very, very open to that message. It's one of the reasons why I think people in Dayton are very open to my message too.
Now, when it comes to statewide races in terms of the Senate and even the governor's race, Ohioans tend to vote a little bit on the more moderate side. I mean,
Sure.
Governor DeWine's more of a moderate Republican. Rob Portman's a more moderate Republican. Sherrod Brown's a more moderate Democrat than other Democrats. Do you see yourself in that mold, or do you see yourself a little bit more to the right?
Well, I'm certainly conservative, and I think Governor DeWine's a conservative. I think Senator Portman was conservative, especially on taxes, on energy policy, on some of the things that delivered prosperity for the people of Ohio. I think it's DeWine has been a good governor for the state of Ohio, and I think he's going to cruise to re-election in part because people have seen the positive effects of his leadership. Obviously, I don't agree with any person in my party on every single issue, but I think at the end of the day, I'm running on common sense, right? Get the taxes, regulations low, bring energy policy back to some basic common sense. We got to, throw violent criminals in prison so that we bring the crime rate under control. We got to close that southern border. To me, this is not so much conservative, liberal, moderate. It's just common sense. A lot of what's gone wrong in this country is that we've gone off the deep end on so many issues. Unfortunately, Tim Ryan has gone right along with this president 100% of the time, President Biden and Nancy Pelosi. I'm offering to take the state in a different direction.
Let's talk about an issue that's impacting a lot of Ohio voters in terms of being a polarizing subject, and that being abortion.
Sure.
A recent poll showed that nearly 60% of Ohio voters support a constitutional amendment to make abortion a right in Ohio. Now, you have made your pro-life stance very well known. What do you say to those 60% of people here in Buckeye State, registered voters, who want to be able to protect abortion, and that may impact the way they vote?
Sure. Well, I think, one, it's important to respect differences here. I recognize I'm pro-life. Not everybody's pro-life. I think a lot of people who are going to vote for me are, in fact, pro-choice, and I welcome their support. To me, the question is really, how do we save as many lives as possible? How do we build a set of policies at the federal, the state, the local level, so that when young women, when young families find themselves in a situation where they've got a pregnancy, whether it's planned or unplanned, they can actually bring that baby into the world in prosperity, in comfort. I think that partially that's a healthcare question. We know a lot of young women feel like they can't have a baby because the healthcare isn't going to be there for them. We really got to fix that. We know a lot of young women would actually like to have a baby and give it up for adoption, but those options aren't available to them. We've really got to fix that. And I think a lot of young families feel like their jobs, their employers aren't going to be sufficiently respectful of their decision to have a baby, and I think we've got to fix that too. So there's a lot that we can do aside from just abortion policy. Again, I am pro-life, but I think there's a lot that we can do, a lot of common ground we can find to make sure that young families bring babies into the world in a situation of comfort and respect. And I think that's the common ground on which I'd like to spend a lot of time working in the Senate.
Now, right now it's up to states, individual states, to decide.
Sure.
Do you think that should still be the case, or do you think Congress should step in and draft up a set of laws?
I think with most policy issues, you're going to have a mixture, right? You're going to have probably Congress setting some minimum standard. I've said, for example, I really think it's reasonable that we should prohibit abortion after 15 weeks, providing reasonable exceptions and so forth. Because, you're talking at that point about a fully formed baby, a baby that can feel pain. And the gross majority of citizens in Ohio and across the country don't think that you should be having elective abortion at that late in pregnancy. And then I think within those confines, the state of Ohio is going to make its decision. And I think that mixture is probably the way that this policy is going to go. I'm certainly supportive of that.
Now, Democrats would want your attention to be on abortion as the main issue driving this election. I know Republicans are looking at the economy, really pushing that out there. But at the end of the day, besides talking points, what do you think voters are actually going to care about when they show up to the polls?
Well, I'd say that voters have every right to care about whatever they want to care about, right? I mean, that's one of the great things about our country is that if abortion is your issue, the economy is your issue, crime is your issue, that's your choice. What I've tried to really hit is that there are a few issues, I think frankly with broad bipartisan agreement, where we've really gone off the deep end as a country. Number one is crime. We've really made it harder for our police officers to do their job. We've let way too many violent criminals out of jail. You see it in the crime statistics, and it's really bad for our communities. Number two, the border. We have a terrible, terrible drug problem in the state of Ohio because the drug cartels are using the open border to traffic a lot of fentanyl into our community. That fentanyl is a deadly poison. We got to get it out of here. We got to close down that border. And I think top of mind when I talk to voters is we've got to get prices back down to a reasonable level. You know, I grew up in a poor family. One of the things that we had, though, is that, yeah, we didn't have a whole lot of dollars, but the dollars went pretty far because we lived in a low inflation environment. When groceries are so expensive, when gas is so expensive, when everything is so expensive, it falls hardest on the people who can least afford it. So we've got to get those prices under control. And I think that starts, again, with getting the spending under control and opening up our energy markets.
Pocketbook issues usually drive elections. JD, real quick here. What is your final closing argument as we enter the final week of Election Day? Tomorrow, the final week of the election season, tomorrow is a week from Election Day. What's your closing argument to voters?
I'd ask people, have their lives gotten better in the last couple of years? And I think for most Ohioans, unfortunately, we've been going in the wrong direction as a country. We've been going in the wrong direction on crime, on inflation, on the border policies. And I represent a change. My very explicit argument is I think that Joe Biden and Tim Ryan have made a lot of mistakes. We need to take the country in a different direction. And that's really the closing argument here. Get back to common sense. Get away from the course we've been on the last couple of years. And I think if you do that, you can redeliver prosperity and safety to people all across our state.
Mr. Vance, we appreciate it as
Thanks,
always.
Vance.
Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, thanks for having me.